Welcome to another tutorial of painting an acrylic portrait of John Bunyan Part 5. And in this tutorial I'll show you how I continue to add shading with value work, details, and just bring this portrait to a greater state of completion. It's past the halfway mark right now, but right now I'm adding some detail to the hair, defining the edges using raw sienna, a little bit of burnt sienna and raw umber dark, and just using a small round brush and getting it to a nice chisel edge. And sometimes when I have too much paint on my brush, you'll see I dab a little bit off the side of the image, right on the right side of the painting, just so that I can control the amount of paint on the brush. And that way I can get it to flow off just how I want it and not have too much paint kind of muddle up the image. So now I am checking the color and I want to just darken the edge of his hair a little bit and get a little more three-dimensionality in the hair at this point. Now darkening all of the edges using raw umber dark, ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, maybe a bit of ivory black, and just getting that definition between the edges of the hair and the background, which is the prison cell he's in, and then the edge between his hair and his cheekbones and jawline. And that's super important to get those dark values locked in. That's what really gives the painting contrast, gives it three-dimensionality, gives it realism and believability. And now I'm transitioning into the forehead area, adding a little bit of a furrowed look to his brow, where it looks like he's concentrating on what he's going to write. You know, John Bunyan was put into prison for preaching the gospel back in the 1600s in England, and he right now is writing Pilgrim's Progress, his famous book. It's second only to the Bible in sales, and I want to capture that moment where he's thinking of what to write next. And you know, maybe he's thinking about his experience in prison and what it's like to be a faithful follower of Jesus Christ, even in the midst of persecution. So I'm putting in the little wrinkles by his nose, the forehead furrow, vertical forehead furrow, and basically using a combination of raw umber dark, a little raw sienna for that. Now I'm going into the nose and adding just a bit of a definition to the edge where it transitions from the shadow into the highlight. And I want to make sure that I have that shape correct. Now I modeled for this portrait. I don't want it to look just like me. If it looks like me a little bit, okay, but I want it to look like the images of John Bunyan that I researched. And John Bunyan had that large mustache and hair that covered his ears. So I did a little research of what he looks like and just wanted to get the likeness as close as possible. Now I'm adding just a little bit of a definition to that furrowed area again, and working on the eyebrows a little bit, adding just a little bit of a dark value on the interior. And that's something where you can really see an improvement in your painting. If you don't treat the eyebrow as just one entity, don't treat it as one value to paint, one layer to paint, but rather notice that some parts of the eyebrow are darker than others. And even in this tiny 8x10 portrait, I'm still differentiating certain spots of the eyebrow. I'm adding some darker shadows to the interior where we would have the eye socket region, because you're not only seeing the color of the eyebrow hairs, but you're seeing the shadows of how those hairs are affected by the different planes of the face. And typically the eye sockets will turn into some degree. They're not going to be aiming toward the light. They'll be recessed away from the light source, and they're going to be more in shadow. And so with that, then the eyebrows are going to be in shadow as well in certain spots. Now I'm transitioning down to the mustache area and just adding a few little areas of texture to delineate and show that he indeed has some mustache hairs. moving back into the shadow by his hair on the left side and his chin, and just getting that little bit of contrast right there. It's so important. Now I want to define the edge of his mustache and the hair a little bit more. And you notice that I dab it with my finger. Sometimes if I put too much paint down, I can just touch it with my finger and lift that paint up. And with that, I'm able to get a little more of a nuanced effect in the painting. So I don't have to accept what I put down with my brush. I can remove some of it away with my finger. At the end of the day, I'll have quite a bit of paint on my fingers, but that's the beauty of acrylic. It's non-toxic and it cleans off pretty easily. So you see me dabbing there, and I want to show a few locks of his hair on the shadowed side. So even in shadow, there's going to be some different values that you want to incorporate. And I see that with a lot of beginning artists. You know, they make their shadows very simplified, but they neglect sometimes to put the shadows within the shadows. So there's dark areas of value, and they occupy certain spaces. And you want to be aware of what those shapes are, what they look like, how big they are, where they reside, and put those in your painting. And that'll really increase your realism. Now moving into the area on his collar, and I'm adding a transitional value out from the dark area under his hair, excuse me, and moving into the lighter area. So we have that large cast shadow, and you can see that grayish shadow being cast across his white collar. But then within that area, there is a dark shadow that gets closer to his hairline, where the hair, you know, goes over that collar. And I am basically putting the dark value within it. Now I put down one layer. I'm going to do another layer on top of that layer and really define the edge. And using a small round brush gives you a great deal of precision, a great deal of control. And you do have to be very careful of your brush work and smooth it out, but I think it's a good balance. It's worth it to use a small brush because you can get a better controlled placement of those nuances, of those shapes of value. Whereas if you were using a large brush, your value shapes would not have as much clarity. They wouldn't have as much variety. So for that reason, using a small brush when you get to this later stage in painting is super important. Now, I'm adding a shadow or strengthening the shadow under his collar because that white collar is going to be casting a shadow onto his clothing. And now I'm darkening the color of his clothing. And here you can see the beauty of the acrylic glazing technique. And again, this is where we use matte medium. It's a clear acrylic polymer resin without pigment. And you mix your paint with it and it makes it translucent. So light shines through. You can see the detail work underneath. But I'm able to darken his entire clothing without having to paint in all the detail of his sleeves, the wrinkles in his arms, and you know, just the different contours. I don't have to paint that all over again. I can simply decide to just darken that area and retain the detail underneath. And not only that, but it gives it more luminosity and more depth because the light's shining through those areas as well. Now I'm darkening the eyes, and again using this small round brush. I believe this is a 1/0 brush, and just using raw umber dark and maybe a little bit of alizarin crimson, just darkening those eyes just a bit. And I want to just get the paint in the right area, because in a small painting like this, it's a little bit of paint in the wrong area makes a big difference. And that's why I'm resting my hand on the canvas and just barely grazing it. And I put just the darkest suggestion of value, not even on the pupil itself, but also on the eyelid too. Now I'm darkening the contrast under his mustache because his mustache will be casting a shadow onto his mouth. And I want to make that area a little more realistic as well. And realism really is illusion. You just see a little bug crawled across the painting. I have an outbuilding for my studio, and there's a lot of cracks in it, so we have bugs and different things, especially when I was painting this. So anyway, wanting to add a little shadow under his mustache area and looking for some opportunities to just refine the shadows along his jawline going into the neck. And I am following the reference photo. You can't see it here on screen, but there is a reference photo that I'm following and really wanting to portray the realism from that. And it's good. It's good to have a reference photo to work from. I modeled for this painting, and having a reference photo makes a big difference. Now, I'm strengthening the shadow under his lip, and there's a certain cast shadow as his lip kind of projects outward, and I'm using a little bit of a warmer tone with some burnt sienna, and then a little bit of a cooler tone on his chin. So under the lip it's a bit warmer, but on his chin it's a little cooler, because I'd imagine he'd have a little bit of a 5 o'clock shadow. You know, he's in prison and he can't shave every day. So maybe he's got a little bit of stubble, and just by painting that more grayish color there, you can suggest that there's stubble. Now I'm going over with just a bit of titanium white and raw umber dark to cool down the shadow and also make that shadow on his collar a little more opaque and just give it a bit more richness and depth. And by using a bit of titanium white, I can get a little bit of a smoother application. Even though the glazing technique is fantastic for going over detail, preserving your detail, and increasing luminosity and increasing depth, it does leave a certain degree of graininess behind. And so you do often have to smooth that out with the use of semi-opaque layers on top. And so in this case, I'm adding, again, titanium white for that purpose. And I want to strengthen the contrast on his collar a little bit and differentiate that value on his collar, the white of the collar, from the skin tones. So the skin tones now look just a bit darker in comparison. And the more levels of contrast, differentiation from values that we can achieve, the better the portrait. Finishing up here in this video by just adding some titanium white to the Bible that's on his table and his text that he's writing on. And that'll wrap it up here for this video, and I plan on showing you more in another video here, painting a portrait of John Bunyan. So thank you so much for watching this video. If you'd like to get in touch with me, you can find some tutorials covering all different techniques in acrylic portrait painting at Realistic Acrylic Portrait School, realisticacrylic.com. Thanks for watching. God bless. Talk to you soon.